Thank you all for coming and hearing Miko speak. We do have some time for some questions and answers. With only one microphone, we are going to have people come forward and briefly ask a question without a mic, so this can stay on Miko's tie. And he will take 3 questions at a time. So please keep them brief so he can write them down and give a full answer. If you just come up here, he can hear you, and then he will repeat the question to all of you.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, what percentage of people in Israel have an attitude like yours? And what do you think the tipping point is? What percentage do we need?
That's an interesting question. She asked that question about Jim Crow in the United States.
Okay. Another question?
Yes. At the end, you were speaking about peace, and you made a hopeful prediction that Israelis and Palestinians can come together. But I just want to point out that there are entire movements in the Middle East and entire governments in the Middle East, very heavily armed ones, that derive almost all their legitimacy from opposing the state of Israel. And don't you think those would be an impediment for the Israelis and Palestinians winning their
So you mean regimes outside of Israel being an impediment?
Yes. Iran, Hezbollah.
Okay.
Just your perspective, having lived in the U.S. for a long time, on why the U.S. has so wholeheartedly supported Israel, and what people can do in the U.S. to change that.
Okay, I'll answer these 3 and then we'll do the rest, okay? And then we'll do 3 more. Okay, the first question is 2 questions. How many people in Israel support my views, and how many would we need to make it work? Well, I would say the percentage of people in Israel who share my views is 0. Unequivocally. Without a doubt. Well...
I know one.
You know one?
I know one.
Well, I know maybe 10, so I'm exaggerating. But there's not many. And the thing is this, when you're the privileged, when you enjoy the privileges of that sort of a regime, you're not, terribly keen on giving them up. Whites in South Africa were not terribly keen on having apartheid end. But they had to live with it. They had to realize that apartheid was coming to an end and they were going to have to live with it. And I think this is true for all regimes that are not democratic. There's always a layer of people who enjoy the benefits, who are privileged. But when the regime is replaced, they have to kind of deal with the new reality that other people have rights as well. And this is the process that Israelis are going to have to go through. Here in the U.S., when racist laws ended, then the people in the South had to deal with it. They didn't like it necessarily. It's not like they said, well, let's stop being bad and let's be nice to colored people. It was a process where they were faced with a reality that there is a democracy is here and they are going to have to deal with it. And they dealt with it quite well. They deal with it in the end quite well. They realize that people may have a different color, they may have a different religion, they may cover their head a different way, but they're still people and we can all get along just fine as long as we respect each other and we have equal rights and equal opportunities. So I'm not suggesting it's an easy proposition, but I am suggesting it is completely possible. And not only that, an idea that comes up as a result of this is, see, you're talking about genocide. You're talking about another Holocaust. You're talking about destroying Israel and killing Jews. Well, they can't quite say I'm anti-Semitic, but they can say it if somebody who's not Jewish suggests this. And I think it's important to understand the transition of power from a racist, evil regime to a democracy does not have to involve violence. There are plenty of examples in the world where this happens, and there's no reason why it can't happen without violence in Israel and Palestine. And suggesting this is not suggesting killing anybody, it's suggesting giving people their rights, allowing people to live, and ending the violence. And there's nothing anti-Semitic about suggesting this. There's nothing anti-Jewish about suggesting this because there's nothing Jewish about the state of Israel. Other than the fact, thank you. Other than the fact that the Zionist leaders decided that they represent Jews. But it was their decision. Nobody ever voted for them. And there are always many, many Jewish people who are anti-Zionist or not Zionist or indifferent to Zionism. But they kind of were self-proclaimed, representatives of the Jewish people. So I'm not suggesting it's an easy thing, but I am suggesting it can be done orderly, and it can be done without violence. And I think it's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing for both people. I don't think the Arab regimes are going to be an impediment. I think the impediment to peace has always been the State of Israel. Arab regimes, good and bad, have been asking Israel for peace since pretty much the very beginning the State of Israel was established. Israel has always refused and always decided that it was going to conduct itself like a bully and scare everybody and be the toughest one and the scariest one and have the biggest army and so on. That was a choice that Israel made. And so I don't think any of the Arab regimes will be an impediment. It's true that many of them, like in Jordan, for example, Mubarak, who thank God left, and perhaps others, enjoy a lot of money from the State of Israel and so on. But who knows, that might change. Why America supports Israel, I think, is the million-dollar question. A lot of the money that Israel gets, officially from Israel, $3 billion, which could go to, building schools and paying teachers and doing all kinds of other things, building hospitals here in America, a lot of that money comes back here to build weapons, to the weapons industry, because Israel buys weapons and has to buy weapons with a certain amount of that money. So a lot of that comes back here. So that's one part of that. The other part of that is that the AIPAC, which is the Israeli lobby, is a very powerful lobby, and they're very successful. And they managed to create an environment where if you want to be a politician in America, you have to bow to Israel. 5 times a day, at certain given times, you have to say, I like Israel. Or else you will not be elected. And it's true all the way from the president down to any city council members. This is the reality of politics in America. And until somebody actually decides they're going to stop it, it's not going to stop. So America has this very, very strange, sick relationship with the State of Israel, but they do feed off each other. I mean, a lot of the money that America kind of gives Israel comes back. It's kind of like laundering money back into the arms industry. And it's important to remember in this context as well that Israel doesn't need money. Israel is not a developing country. It's not a poor country. It doesn't need American money. We're not saving lives when the money goes there. We're not helping to bring about water or anything like that. It's money that goes to destroy Palestinians. And it's money that goes to support a racist regime that holds thousands of political prisoners and kills people at will. And so it's very important that Americans here make it clear to their politicians that it's time to stop this support. And actually what would be the right thing to do is for American politicians to compete on how much they oppose Israel, not how much they support Israel. Yes, please, we can do 3 more.
Do you mind if I ask you 3, or should I just do 2?
You can ask 3.
Oh, thanks. All right, 2 are technical, one's more general. My first question is about, you mentioned during the 67 war, the Strait of
Tehran.
So here's the thing. You said Egypt was threatening to close it. So when Iran was threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, they didn't just out of thin air say, hey, we want to close it. They said, if Israel attacks us, we'll close it. So it's not what the media has been saying. So I was wondering, did Egypt just out of thin air say, we want to close Timor, or was it in retaliation to a threat or a counter threat? Second question, if ever in my lifetime a 2-state solution is established, geographically, how would you link the West Bank to Gaza? Because everybody says we want to make them a state, but nobody says, well, how are we going to connect them? Because this would, require going through Israeli territory or around the water or anything. So technically, how would that work out? And my last question is, last week Palestine deposited its bid at the UN for non-member state. They tried the state last year, it didn't work. Maybe this year the non-member state would work, but do you think if it does work, that would actually move this forward? Or would it just be a step in the right direction, but not really an advancement?
Okay. Well, just for fairness, let's take one more, so that way you're not just standing there.
Sorry about that.
I was just going to ask, what you mentioned the youth, and I think that was really a poignant point. And how would you start by dismantling institutions that are involved in apartheid state, and what's the best form of activism? And I think that when you touched on youth, that was something that resonated with me, because they're the future generations, and they're the ones that are going to have the say in the future.
Yeah, good point. Are you the last one? Do you want to go ahead and ask one, and we'll just kind of go.
Okay.
Get all done.
So just very quickly, so I've heard of one of the major criticisms of the one-state solution is that it's not pragmatic, it's not practical, yada 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 yada. So I mean, what is like one state?
Not
Even
pragmatic.
two-state. I've heard both sides. But like for you, what is your favorite vision of a one-state solution? Whether it's a binational state, fully secular, there's different federations within one.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Okay, let's see. The first one was why Egypt. Egypt didn't actually block the Straits of Tiran. It was threatening to block the Straits of Tiran, and why Egypt decided to do those things when it did is it's a big question. I think it's a big enough question for an entire presentation, and there are lots of different theories, and I never got a clear answer. So I'm kind of I'm not crazy about the idea of speculating. But they didn't actually close the Straits of Tiran. The story, well, I will say one version of what took place, just to kind of put a closure on it. What is being said was, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that Egypt was getting some kind of information that Israel was about to attack Syria. It was getting this information from the Russian government. Now Egypt and Syria had a pact in those days. It's called the United Arab Republic. Thank you. And so they had to act in their defense, and that's what propelled the whole thing. But nobody investigated long enough before they started the war. Had they waited a little bit longer and engaged in diplomacy, this probably would have fizzled out. But nobody knows for sure. But they didn't actually do it. They threatened to do it, and this is one of the theories, is that that's why they did that. The two-state solution and how Gaza and the West Bank will be connected, I can't answer that because there will never be a two-state solution. And I can't emphasize this enough. The notion that the state of Israel will agree to part with part of the land is absolutely absurd. It means a complete misreading, or not to say misunderstanding, of the state of Israel and Zionism. The last 65 years have proven beyond any doubt, if you're just willing to look and read the fine print, that there is never going to be a Palestinian Arab state between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Israel will never allow it. And therefore Israel cannot be a partner to any peace agreement because it refuses to make peace. And that's why what I'm suggesting is the only possibility for peace is a transition from an Israel to a, whatever you'll call it, Israel-Palestine or whatever, which is a state that belongs to everybody, a state where there are equal rights for all the citizens, not only for Israeli Jews. So all these questions, and I'll say one more thing about the two-state solution. It's being used very cynically by many politicians as a fig leaf to allow the ongoing ethnic cleansing and destruction of Palestine by Israel. Because the claim is, what we want is a two-state solution. But we can't have it because Palestinians are terrorists and they won't make concessions and we can't really talk to them. And this guy's a terrorist and that guy's Hamas and this guy's Hamas and that guy's something else. And there's always a reason why we can't. And they don't recognize us and they do recognize us. Now, it's not like everything stands still. Israel builds massive cities and towns and highways for Israeli only in the West Bank. The West Bank no longer exists. While they make all these excuses of why a two-state solution is not possible. But it might be in the future once the Palestinians are nice enough. So it's used as a fig leaf to allow all this to continue. That's why it's very important to stop talking about the two-state solution and to talk about the transition from a Zionist state to democracy. That has to be the conversation. Because as long as we talk about this other distraction, Israel is permitted to continue with its crimes. The UN thing, I don't think it's going to pass, just like the previous attempt to be recognized as a state didn't pass because, America is kind of in lockstep with Israel, and Israel won't allow it, and it won't make any difference anyway. Even if the United Nations did recognize Palestinians as a state, it matters nothing because Israel has the land, and it won't allow them to do anything. The Palestinians have an authority and they have a president. The Palestinian president needs a permit from the Israeli army that needs to be renewed every 3 months. in order to drive around his authority. He cannot get in his helicopter and fly, from one place to another, from one Palestinian city to another, without a permit from the Israeli army. He's not a president. It's a joke. It's a sad joke, but it's a joke. So the whole notion of the two states and a Palestinian state is really a distraction. I think we need to stop talking about it. How do you dismantle institutions of apartheid? I think that's an interesting question. It would be an interesting subject for a paper, I think. I mean, you have to go look at what happened in other countries, other racist countries, and other fascist regimes where these things got dismantled and you had to reinstitute mostly the education system, or reinstate the education system so that they were not racists. But this is an interesting process. And look, the thing to remember is this. What I'm proposing, and it's not me proposing, it's a proposal that's out there by people who are far more knowledgeable and smarter than I am. They've been talking about this for a very long time, both Israelis and Palestinians and others. This is the first step. That's not to say there won't be problems. Show me a state that doesn't have problems. But it's a step that you have to take first. Until we take that step, we won't be able to solve any of the other issues like the institutions of apartheid and racism, and how do you stop teaching people racism. But like I said, I'm optimistic, and I'm mostly optimistic because Israeli and Palestinian societies are very similar. Very, very similar. And if you look at other multi-nation states, if you look at Belgium and Switzerland and India and some others, the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians and the similarities between Israelis and Palestinians are so striking that if this happened tomorrow, it would be seamless. It would be seamless. People think, oh, they're culturally different, they're religiously different, they're this different. They're not so different. First of all, most Israelis and most Palestinians are not that religious. So they have their traditions and they keep them, but they have different levels of religion. Most Israelis and Palestinians, the education levels are very high. Literacy is over 92% on both sides. Both societies have a rich upper class that they hate and they want to get rid of. Very corrupt, very rich. They have corrupt. Both sides have very corrupt politicians. But I mean, who doesn't? And both sides have a fringe of fanatic religious groups, and they want to see their power diminish. And the only way to diminish their power is to work together, the people in the middle. So the possibilities, and their languages are not that different. Many Palestinians speak Hebrew. Many Israelis come from Arab countries. Over 50% of Israelis have their roots in Arab countries. Families that immigrated from Arab countries, so Arabic is part of their culture. So I mean, I think this is important to realize, and when you form your opinion on whether or not it's possible in your lifetime, it's going to happen. You have to take that into consideration. The claim that one-state solution is not pragmatic, that's a really good point. Because a two-state solution has proven itself to be very pragmatic. I mean, over the last 45 years, it made it absolutely obvious that a two-state solution is very practical and it's right around the corner, except we never reached that corner. So the claim of being pragmatic is one that I like a lot. It's a great exercise. Another thing I'll say is this. I don't know if you remember that Egypt had a president called Mubarak. A year before he was thrown out, if anybody came into a room and suggested that a popular revolution in Egypt would throw out President Mubarak, they would have been sent to an asylum and locked up immediately. It would mean that you completely misunderstand the Middle East and you completely misunderstand Egypt. There were preparations for his son Jamal to take his place already. He was, 150 years old or something, like a pharaoh. And they were preparing for this. And suddenly, a popular resistance. There's 80 million people in Egypt? It took less than 1 million to kick him out. He's gone. So nobody knows what's really pragmatic. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. But we do know that if the right pressures are applied, and the right energy is applied, and the right principles are applied, like human rights, equal rights, civil rights, then things like this become suddenly very pragmatic very quickly. So anyway, do you guys have more questions?
Maybe we can make these three the last.
Yes, definitely the last. Go ahead.
I have a suggestion more than a question
Okay.
about what we could perhaps maybe do as American citizens, since funding seems to be the issue, that you're saying that we're funding this, we're giving them this money that's circled back around weapons and the violence. And I actually had the idea when I was watching the sit-ins and the way that the police were treating these people in our own country who were sitting peacefully protesting. I think if we could get enough people to refuse to pay their income taxes, this is a peaceful way to protest, and this is a powerful way. We're going to hit them where their pocket is. They won't have the money to give to them. They won't have money to pay the police to attack us when we're trying to protest peacefully.
Now there's a revolutionary idea. I like it. Thank you. Yes.
So my question is a twofold, and I want to go back to the two-state solution. So first of all, you said that in 1993, the Israeli government decided to go into negotiations because it became very clear that there's no way that a Palestinian state would ever exist. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that or talk a little more specifically about the circumstances in 93. Secondly, you mentioned the corrupt Palestinian government, and I wanted to ask you whether that's an important factor as well, whether Palestinian politicians stand a lot to gain from both the conflict and the two-state solution.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I'm just having difficulty understanding your optimism, given that you said that something like 0% of Israelis share your opinion. Certainly there's not a great deal of pressure in the U.S. or leverage in the U.S. in favor of that. And that the UN doesn't seem like a mechanism of change that you see, and I agree with those points for the most part. Maybe I think that there are a lot of Israelis who might have different opinions, if not exactly in line with yours. But given all of that, you mentioned the need to have the right pressures applied. I'm just curious about what in fact you see is, if you think that in fact this could change within your lifetime or any of ours, what exactly would that look like?
Okay, good question. Thank you. Okay. I like the first idea with the taxes. So we talked about this the other day. Does anybody here remember there used to be a state called South Vietnam?
Yes.
Because some of us are older, remember. And just before South Vietnam disappeared off the face of the earth, President, I think it was Gerald Ford, swore that America will never forsake its ally in Southeast Asia. That, South Vietnam stands in the way of communism and America will never forsake it. It is, it is the only democracy in Southeast Asia, and on and on and on and on and on. And interestingly enough, my father, after he retired, he wrote for one of the Israeli newspapers, Ma'ariv, and they sent him on a mission to South Vietnam to write, and he was there for about 6 weeks. And because he was a retired general, the South Vietnamese generals took him in and talked to him, and he saw a lot of interesting things. And this was, I think it was 1973. It was early 1973, which is pretty much very close to the end of the war. And this was still a time when presidents in America and politicians in America were talking about how they will never forsake South Vietnam. And he started writing articles back, and he said the Americans are leaving. And people said, what are you talking about? They're swearing up and down that they will never leave. He said, yes, but there are no more spare parts. The Army is not getting spare parts. So if an Army Jeep has, goes on, gets blown on, on a mine, on a minefield or something, then it's gone. There's not going to be another one. And that was the first signs. So, when Americans want to accomplish something, they know how to do it. When Americans decided to leave Vietnam, that was it. The Americans, people spoke, Congress listened, the president listened, it was done. So if Americans want $3 billion a year, plus the other $2 billion that are given as donations and stuff like that, through tax-exempt donations and stuff like that, that's a lot of money that could go to good use here in the U.S. They know what to do, and stopping tax is a good idea. Okay, what happened in 1993? Well, several things happened in 1993. First of all, like I said, it was absolutely clear that the conquest and the building in the West Bank was irreversible. So the Israelis didn't really have to worry about anything. The other thing, there was plenty of pressure applied on Israel and on the U.S. to do something about the Palestinian problem. So they figured out a way to do something without achieving results, which is this ongoing, endless negotiations. So they recognized the PLO, they shook hands with the PLO, they allowed some money to come into the PLO, they found a few corruptible leaders that were willing to come in and sit in. Now, not all of them were corruptible. I don't want to create this impression that all Palestinian leaders are corrupt. I think many Palestinians and Palestinian leaders believed that this was the beginning of the end and that this was going to be the end of the war and that there will be a Palestinian state. There's no question that they were duped by many of them were duped by Israel and by the U.S. But the atmosphere around the world, was the end. The Berlin Wall fell and apartheid in South Africa fell, and it was kind of a time of hope and change in the world. So it looked like this was also going to go in that same direction. There was a lot of pressure on Israel to do this. And finally, there were a couple of Israeli and American people who thought this Oslo thing is a good idea. It's kind of a small thing. We give them a little bit of Gaza, which we really don't want anyway. We'll give them a little bit of Jericho, which is nobody cares about anyway. And let's start with that. And then they start delaying and postponing because they had deadlines. They had benchmarks, I should say, for when Israel should pull out and when Palestinians can get independence. And Israel completely ignoring these benchmarks. I remember in 1995, just before my father died, there was a big interview with him in the Israeli paper, because he had cancer and people kind of knew that he was on his way. And the headline, this was in the weekend paper, which is a big deal in Israel, and the headline on the cover was, Miko Peled says, Rabin does not want peace. This was 1995. Anybody remember? That was the height of Oslo. Rabin was the man of peace. Nobel Peace Prize and whatnot. And people said, are you out of your mind? How can you say that? He said, well, I read the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords are not going to lead to peace. They're not talking about a peace. They're talking about surrender and complete Israeli control over the lives of Palestinians. So on the one hand, you had this atmosphere that required the Israelis to engage in something. Plus, there's a lot more money coming from the U.S. Plus, it made Bill Clinton look much better. Plus, there's all these Nobel Peace Prizes out there to be given out. So it was the atmosphere to do things. At the same time, they figured out how to not accomplish anything. Now, yes, all corrupt leaders. When people talk about Palestinian corruption, I like to remind them that out of 12 Israeli prime ministers, 5 were charged with corruption, or at least suspicion of corruption. Not all of them are actually charged because they are prime ministers, and so they do have some benefits, some privileges. But Sharon, had he been alive, he'd probably been in jail, or he's alive, but he's not, kind of alive. Corrupt leaders. It's not the end of the world, and of course it's something we see everywhere. And of course, corrupt leaders and corrupt people like conflict, because you have to sell arms, and you have to sell cement for the wall, and you have to do all kinds of things. So there's a lot of profits, there's a lot to be gained by war, and a lot of corrupt people are enjoying this. I think the biggest criminals of all are the arms dealers. Look at Syria. I think if anybody has to, and I don't believe in violence at all. I'm pacifist, but I think in the case of Syria, the people who sell arms to Syria, to both sides, should be tried, if not, hung. Okay, my optimism. You're right. There is no Israeli public opinion does not support this notion at all. I mean, there are a few Israelis that talk about this. There's certainly no reason to think that the U.S. would ever support this unless Israel supports this, or unless for some reason it becomes politically acceptable. And the United Nations has no teeth. We can't rely on the United Nations because Israel has never respected any United Nations resolutions. So why am I optimistic? Well, I'm optimistic because I'm an optimist, number one. You can't be an activist if you're not optimistic. I mean, you can't. I mean, what's the point of doing all this if you're not optimistic? Might as well hit your head against the wall. But there are certain things that are taking place that give me that give me hope. From the outside, you see there is a change. I'm going to be speaking. I've been speaking for several weeks now around the country. I'm going to be speaking properly till the Thanksgiving, nonstop. And a lot of the invitations that I get are by American Jews. There's this notion that American Jews support Israel. But they like to create the notion that people who support Zionism are the mainstream. They're not the mainstream. And more American Jews are looking at this Zionist thing, at the state of Israel, and they're saying, you know what, we don't necessarily support a country that has thousands of political prisoners and acts this way. And not every time we go to worship on a Saturday, we want to see the Israeli flag, who represents for many people represents evil. So there is a trend of more and more American Jews disassociating themselves from Zionism, and there's a trend, generally speaking, around the country. I don't know if you know, like a lot of colleges have like Students for Justice of Palestine, or like they have here, and And they have these week-long, Palestine Week or Israeli Apartheid Week. And this only started 5-6 years ago, I think in California, and there were 2 or 3 colleges that held these. Last year there were 120 colleges that held, Palestine Awareness Week and Apartheid Week. And thousands and thousands and thousands of students saw this and participated and learned about this. I spoke at several, a lot of speakers, wonderful speakers, who talk about this issue. So there's a growing number of people, young people, who are learning about this. And these young people who are members of all these different groups and conduct these are amazing people. They're not all Palestinian, by the way. Some of them are Jewish, some of them are not, but these are people who care enough to actually put this together. And it's not easy. They fight the pro-Israel groups, they fight the administration. It's not an easy thing, not an easy task. And so that's another thing that's taking place here in the US. You may have heard of the BDS movement. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's taken from the model of fighting apartheid in South Africa. It's very effective. It's very small, but it's very effective. When the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra goes to play at Royal Albert Hall in London every year, the BBC typically, airs it on the BBC. They didn't do it this year. And there were signs, and there was a lot of protest against Israel. That is huge. Products are being boycotted. What's it called? Sabra hummus, or whatever it is. The Sabra products are being taken off shelves. Major companies that invest in Israel are losing money because people take them out of their investment portfolios. So there's a growing movement of people that are realizing it's bad for business to deal with Israel. Now, the one more thing is that there's an ongoing popular resistance movement in Palestine. There's probably a dozen places, and it grows every few months, of places where Palestinians engage in protest. Peaceful marches every Friday and every Saturday. And when this began, 2005, 2006, something like that, there were 1 or 2 places. Today there's probably a dozen. And whenever I'm there, I go and I participate in these protests. And many Israelis do too. Many Israeli activists go. But what's interesting is, when Israelis go and participate in these, like when I go, we go, sometimes we get arrested because the army shows up and they beat everybody up. But at the end of the day, the Israelis go home. I get arrested several times, but I know that at the end of the day, I'm going home. It's a script that's been, everybody knows in advance. The Palestinians, when they get arrested, they might be in jail for a year. Nobody knows. They might be 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 30-year-olds. It makes no difference. If they get arrested at a protest, then they can be incarcerated for periods of times that are indefinite. And what's worse is, a day or 2 later, the Israeli army will raid the village or raid the town in the middle of the night, barge in, destroy homes, yank kids out of their beds, terrorize families, again, arrest people and so on. And then, what's interesting is this. When these people come out of jail, the first thing they do is they go to the Friday protest. They are unstoppable and undefeatable. And they are so determined that they will never stop. And this is true for the people who govern and run the BDS movement. This is true for all the different groups, all the different pro-Palestine groups in the colleges here in the US and universities. They will not stop. Israel does not understand what kind of resistance it's facing. And that's why the pro-Israeli groups are more and more panicky and more hysterical. They do not understand that they're facing a resistance that cannot be defeated and will not ever stop. And this is why I'm optimistic. This is why I'm optimistic. Do you have a question? Are we done? Or I'm sorry, she's the boss.
We have to wrap it up.
We have to wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay, if you want the book, it's on thegeneralsun.com. Thank you all very much.